The thing about forbidden archaeological sites is that they become forbidden for reasons that seem perfectly sensible right up until a human shows up and asks why. Ythros 9 squatted in the Andromeda Reach like a tombstone nobody wanted to read, its surface pockmarked with ruins so old that even the decay had decayed. For 347 standard years, the Galactic Preservation Council had maintained a rotating staff of xeno-archaeologists on site, all of them dutifully cataloging, measuring and absolutely not activating anything that glowed, hummed, or looked at them funny. The planet represented one of 6 confirmed forbidden realms, planets where the old gods had apparently set up shop before deciding that cosmic retirement was more appealing than managing the universe. The excavation site designated Thetos 7 had yielded the usual haul: crumbling temples, indecipherable warnings, etched in substances that predated matter as currently understood, and enough ominous statuary to fill a museum dedicated entirely to things that should have stayed buried. Standard procedure. Then the humans arrived with their grant money and their enthusiasm, and their spectacular disregard for phrases like catastrophic dimensional breach. The idol came out of the ground on a Thursday, which would later seem significant to exactly nobody except the human team member who insisted that Thursdays had a vibe. It measured 2 meters tall, carved from obsidian that somehow remained room temperature despite Ythros 9's surface temperature hovering at a balmy -40 degrees. The stone pulsed with a rhythm that might have been a heartbeat if hearts typically beat once every 7 minutes, and in colors that had no business existing in 3-dimensional space. Within 6 hours the Warden arrived. The Warden species had evolved on a planet where volcanic activity occurred with such regularity that their entire civilization had developed around the concept of knowing when to run. This translated culturally into a society absolutely obsessed with warnings, protocols, and never ever touching anything without filing the appropriate paperwork first. They stood 3 meters tall, vaguely crystalline in composition, and possessed the kind of gravitas that suggested they had seen terrible things and taken extensive note. This particular Warden, designated by the human team as the Big Nervous One, materialized at the dig site with 12 security drones and an expression that managed to convey existential dread, despite his face being composed of approximately 7 flat planes of quartz. "You excavated a divine relic," he intoned, his voice resonating at frequencies that made human dental fillings ache. From the stratum of silence, the human expedition leader, a woman who had earned her doctorate by correctly identifying 37 extinct languages from a single fragmented cookbook, nodded enthusiastically. "We know. Exciting, right?" The Warden's crystalline structure actually creaked with tension. "The old gods are silent. They have been silent for 6 million years. 17 species have attempted communion with relics of this classification. All attempts have failed. 4 resulted in localized temporal instability. 2 caused the researchers involved to experience their deaths in reverse. 1 simply made everyone within a 15-kilometer radius forget the concept of left." "But nobody died?" the expedition leader asked with the kind of optimism that made insurance companies raise their premium. 3 species went extinct shortly after their attempts. The Warden continued, apparently determined to establish the full scope of terrible ideas this represented. Correlation remains unproven, but strongly suspect. The human team had gathered around the idol by this point, their scanner arrays humming with activity that was definitely against at least 47 regulations. The artifact sat in its excavation cradle, pulsing its impossible colors into the thin atmosphere, completely inert to every probe, sensor, and increasingly desperate prayer the galactic community had thrown at it for 3 centuries. Among the gathered researchers stood the protagonist of our tale, though referring to her as such seemed to give her too much credit for forward thinking. She had arrived on Ythros 9 3 months prior, with impeccable credentials in comparative theology, a dissertation on trans-dimensional communication patterns in extinct civilizations, and what her previous supervisors had diplomatically termed an inconvenient tendency toward curiosity. Growing up on a research station orbiting a pulsar had done interesting things to her neural chemistry, or so the medical assessments suggest. Nothing dangerous, just minor fluctuations in her brainwave patterns that occasionally let her perceive electromagnetic fields and made her absolutely terrible at meditation. The meditation thing probably should have disqualified her from working with divine artifacts, but the university had needed someone willing to spend 2 years on a frozen death world, and she had needed to escape a particularly awkward situation involving her thesis advisor's husband and a misunderstanding about conference room reservation. She stood now, staring at the idol with the kind of focus that made her colleagues nervous, and had once caused a visiting dignitary to ask if humans required regular feeding to prevent them from eating each other. The warden had launched into what could only be described as a lecture, complete with holographic illustrations of previous failures. The Vex Collective attempted activation using harmonic resonance. The resulting feedback loop caused their homeworld's oceans to temporarily become sentient and file for independence. The crystalline concordat tried direct neural interface. All 7 researchers reported meeting themselves in the space between thoughts and coming away with unfavorable opinion. "They have humans tried?" she asked, cutting through what promised to be a 40-minute presentation about cosmic-scale bad decisions. The warden's crystalline face somehow managed to convey the expression of someone whose worst nightmare was asking follow-up questions. "Humans have been on Ethros 9 for 4 months. This is the first divine relic unearthed during your tenure. The protocols clearly state, but before, has anyone asked humans to try?" The silence that followed stretched long enough for Ethros 9 to rotate another 3 degrees. "Why?" the warden asked slowly, each word carefully measured. "Would we deliberately introduce the galaxy's most unpredictable species to artifacts of terrible cosmic power?" She smiled, and later, when the reports were filed and the emergency meetings convened, at least 6 observers would note that the smile had appeared approximately 4 seconds before the really poor decision-making began. "Because we're good at turning things on," she offered. The expedition leader stepped forward, recognizing the particular gleam in her subordinate's eye. "We should establish proper scanning protocols, run background radiation analysis, perhaps consult with the Council's Theological Assessment Committee. Those committees have been consulting for 300 years, she pointed out, taking a step closer to the idol. "The committees have committees," I checked. "There's a committee dedicated to discussing whether other committees are necessary. There are procedures," the warden insisted, his voice taking on the desperate quality of someone watching a small mammal approach a hungry predator. "Safeguards, protective equipment, mental conditioning. You cannot simply touch." But she had already closed the distance, her hand reaching out toward the obsidian surface with the kind of confidence that suggested either deep expertise or profound stupidity. The warden would later testify that he attempted to physically intervene, but human reflexes, particularly those enhanced by growing up in high-gravity environments near stellar anomalies, operated at speeds that made crystalline biology look positively sluggish. Her fingertips brushed the idol's surface. For a moment nothing happened and the universe held its breath with the kind of anticipation usually reserved for supernovae and tax audits. Then the idol woke up, and "woke up" was really the only appropriate phrase for what occurred. Despite its complete inadequacy in describing an event that would require 17 new branches of physics to properly explain. The thing about touching artifacts of terrible cosmic power is that there is always that brief window where you get to think, well, maybe this time will be different before the universe proves you catastrophically wrong. She had exactly enough time to register that the obsidian felt warm, which made no sense given the ambient temperature, and possessed a texture that her brain kept trying to classify as both smooth stone and living skin before the idol decided to have opinions about being touched. The light that erupted from the artifact was not light in any conventional sense. Light behaved according to established physical principles. Light traveled at a set speed, could be measured, bent around massive objects in predictable ways, and generally followed the rule. This was light that had apparently skipped the orientation session on how reality worked and decided to improvise. It punched through the visible spectrum, shattered it like cheap glass, and kept going into colors that had no names because no species had ever needed to describe them. Her colleagues would later report seeing shades of urgent, Tuesday afternoon, and something that translated roughly to the feeling you get when you remember an embarrassing thing you said 7 years ago. The excavation site, the entire blessed dig site that had been carefully maintained at exactly -40 degrees for 3 centuries, suddenly experienced what the environmental sensors would diplomatically record as localized thermal confusion. Temperature readings spiked, dropped, inverted, and briefly registered as yes. Reality around the idol began to hiccup, Space folded in ways that made nearby researchers taste mathematical. The ground beneath the artifact rippled like water, except the ripples were moving backward in time, and also somehow diagonally to conventional causality. One of the security drones blinked out of existence, then back in, then sort of halfway in while also being completely out, achieving a state of being that quantum physicists had theorized about but assumed would require significantly more expensive equipment to observe. The Warden, to his credit, did not simply scream and run, though his crystalline structure produced a sound not unlike a chandelier in an earthquake, which conveyed roughly the same sentiment. His security drones immediately established a perimeter, which would have been more useful if the perimeter had not suddenly become a non-Euclidean shape that hurt to look at directly. The other team members responded with the kind of discipline that comes from extensive training. Two immediately began screaming in opposite directions. One dropped his scanner and adopted a fetal position. Another somehow maintained enough composure to keep recording with her camera despite the footage later, revealing that time had been moving in 3 different speeds simultaneously. And the expedition leader started shouting instructions that ranged from "someone get the emergency protocols," to "has anyone seen my left shoe," to "why is the sky doing that?" The sky was indeed doing. Wythros 9's perpetually overcast atmosphere had split open like a poorly healed wound, revealing what looked like stars, except stars did not typically blink in patterns that seemed to be communicating in dead language. Meanwhile, at the center of this cosmic tantrum, she remained standing with her hand on the idol, her consciousness suddenly somewhere else entirely. Elsewhere was vast, elsewhere was hungry, elsewhere had been waiting. She touched something that existed in the spaces between thoughts, in the pause between heartbeats, in the cosmic silence that fills the void between galaxies. It was aware of her in the way that an ocean is aware of a single drop of water, except this ocean had intentions, and those intentions were complex and ancient, and possessed a sense of humor that ran toward the apocalypse. Her mind, that fragile collection of electrical impulses and chemical reactions that believed itself to be a person, suddenly had company. The presence that brushed against her consciousness was not hostile, but it was not friendly either. It was curious in the way that a child is curious about an insect, right before deciding whether to observe it or pull off its wings. She felt herself being examined, catalogued, measured against criteria that had nothing to do with physical dimensions and everything to do with qualities she had no names for. The presence turned her over, in its attention like a jeweler inspecting a stone, looking for flaws, inclusions, anything interesting. Then it found something it liked, and she felt it smile, which was objectively terrifying because whatever was doing the smiling did not have anything resembling a face. Back in normal reality, where time was only moving in one direction, and space had the courtesy to stay 3-dimensional, the light show reached a crescendo that made everyone who was not already on the ground reconsider their vertical status. The obsidian idol blazed with luminescence that should have been blinding but somehow was not, the kind of light you could stare directly into and still see clearly, which was its own special kind of wrong. Symbols began appearing in the air around it, script that predated writing, language that existed before language was invented, meaning carved directly into the fabric of space-time, like graffiti from gods who did not care about property value. The Warden managed to access his communication array, despite his entire body vibrating at frequencies that threatened to shatter his crystalline matrix. Emergency transmission to Preservation Council, Divine Relic activation, full containment breach, request immediate. The light vanished, not gradually, not with a fade or a flicker, but with the absolute certainty of a door slamming shut. One moment, reality was melting like wax in a furnace. The next, everything was calm, quiet, and deeply suspicious about what had just occurred. She stood exactly where she had been standing, her hands still resting on the idol's surface, completely unharmed, and wearing an expression that suggested she had just experienced something profound and was not entirely sure how to feel about it. The idol continued to glow, but softly now with a warm amber radiance that seemed almost friendly in comparison to the reality-breaking light show of moments before. The obsidian surface pulsed with that slow 7-minute heartbeat, but now it felt less like a countdown to cosmic disaster, and more like a greeting,
like the artifact was saying hello after a very, very long nap. She removed her hand slowly, half expecting something else to happen, but the idol simply continued its gentle glow, apparently satisfied with the interaction. "Well," she said, her voice remarkably steady for someone who had just been cosmically evaluated. "That was new." The warden made a sound like shattering glass, which his species used to express emotions, ranging from mild concern to the heat death of the universe is imminent, and possibly my fault. In this context, it probably meant something closer to I am having an existential crisis, and will be filing approximately 900 incident reports. The expedition leader, who had somehow located her missing shoe, approached cautiously. "Are you injured? Experiencing any sudden urges to speak in dead languages, or consume celestial body?" "I feel fine," she replied, which was technically true if you ignored the part where she could now perceive approximately 17 new colors, and had a lingering sense that something vast and ancient had just given her the equivalent of a cosmic thumbs up. The symbols that had appeared in the air remained, hovering around the idol like attentive butterflies made of pure meaning. They rotated slowly, each one representing concepts that would take linguists decades to fully translate, but the overall message was becoming clear, even through the haze of incomprehension. It was not a warning. It had never been a warning. It was a greeting card. The warden's security drones, having recovered from their brief excursion into quantum uncertainty, immediately began scanning the symbol. The data they transmitted caused the warden's crystalline structure to produce a sound not unlike sobbing, if sobbing could shatter wine glasses at 40 paces. "The old gods," he whispered, his voice fracturing into harmonics of pure distress. "They are not silent. They were never silent." She looked at the glowing idol, at the dancing symbols, at her own hand that had somehow bridged a gap 6 million years wide. They were just waiting for the right species to pick up the phone. And somewhere in the space between stars, in the cosmic silence that was not silent at all, something ancient laughed with what might have been delight, or might have been the universe's longest setup to the galaxy's worst joke.
The emergency transmission reached the Galactic Preservation Council approximately 14 minutes after the idol activated, which was impressive considering that half the message consisted of the warden's crystalline structure producing sounds that the translation matrix kept rendering as prolonged screaming in 17 harmonic keys. The council's response was textbook bureaucratic panic. Form 3 committees. Dispatch 7 representatives, and under no circumstances allow anyone to touch anything else until at least 45 forms had been filed in triplicate. The representatives arrived within 4 hours, which violated several laws of physics, but apparently the phrase human-activated divine relic had a way of making faster-than-light travel, suddenly very motivated to exceed its theoretical limitations. They came from across the explored galaxy, architect collective hive mind, that occupied 6 bodies and possessed doctorates in theological xenoarchaeology from 12 universities, a deep void observer, whose species had evolved in interstellar space, and saw reality from approximately 8 more dimensions than everyone else, a harmonic, whose body was essentially a living tuning fork, and claimed direct lineage from a species that had once received actual emails from minor deities, and 4 others who represented various academic institutions and government, all of them unified by their shared expression of barely controlled terror. The idol sat in its cradle, glowing pleasantly, apparently oblivious to the crisis it had caused. "Human-touched divine artifact," the lead architect body stated, its voice harmonizing with its other 5 bodies in a way that suggested intense conversation happening across multiple thought streams. Artifact respond. "This represents unprecedented occurrence in 6 million years of recorded attempts." The deep void observer drifted closer to the idol, its form flickering between dimensions in a way that made standard biology uncomfortable. The activation pattern matches theoretical models for old god communication protocols. However, 17 species have attempted similar contact. All failed to achieve response. "Maybe they were not asking nicely," she offered, earning a look from the expedition leader that suggested silence might be strategically advantageous. The harmonic approached the idol with reverence bordering on religious fervor, which made sense given that its entire civilization was essentially a musical theater production, dedicated to cosmic entities. It extended one crystalline appendage toward the glowing obsidian surface. Nothing happened. The harmonic tried again, this time humming at frequencies that made everyone's teeth ache and temporarily convinced 3 researchers that they could smell colors. The idol continued glowing, indifferent to the harmonic's entire musical range. Perhaps different approach, the architect suggested, and proceeded to have 6 bodies touch the idol simultaneously while forming a neural network that could calculate pi to 1,000,000 decimal places, while also composing poetry. The idol remained thoroughly unimpressed. Over the next 3 hours, every representative attempted contact. The deep void observer phased partially out of reality to match what it claimed was the idol's dimensional frequency. The architect collective tried everything from mathematical proofs to interpretive dance performed across 6 bodies. One representative from a species whose name translated roughly to the eternal students of ultimate wisdom spent 40 minutes meditating at the idol while chanting in a dead language they had spent 3 centuries learning specifically for occasions like this. Absolutely nothing worked. This represents problem, the architect announced its 6 bodies, managing to look simultaneously baffled, frustrated, and academically intrigued. Divine relics do not demonstrate species preference. Authentication protocols in ancient technology operate on universal principles: consciousness recognition, energy signature, harmonic resonance, not genetic marker. Unless, the deep void observer suggested, its multi-dimensional form flickering with something that might have been excitement or might have been indigestion. The authentication criteria are not biological. The expedition leader cleared her throat. We could test whether other humans can activate it. Which is how 20 minutes later, 5 different human team members each approached the idol and laid their hands upon its surface. 3 attempts produced nothing. The idol remained glowing but inert, apparently unmoved by their touch. The 4th attempt caused the idol to pulse slightly brighter for approximately 3 seconds before returning to its baseline glow. The 5th attempt, performed by a human engineer who had 0 archaeological training and was primarily present to maintain the camp's water recycling system, caused the idol to flash brilliant amber and produce a single symbol in the air that translated roughly to hello, but less enthusiastically than last time. The gathered scientists erupted into 13 different languages of academic discourse, which is similar to regular discourse, except everyone is louder and more insistent about their hypotheses. She watched the chaos unfold with growing understanding. It is not working every time, not even for humans. Inconsistent activation pattern. The architect agreed, its 6 bodies already running calculations, but activation threshold clearly lower for human consciousness. Question becomes why human? The deep void observer had been scanning her neural patterns for the past hour, and now flickered excitedly between dimensions. Human neurological structure demonstrates high emotional volatility, capacity for simultaneous contradictory belief. Evolutionary history includes throwing things at problems until problems go away. These qualities are not typically considered advantages in sentient species. Thank you for that assessment, she said dryly. However, the observer continued, these qualities also create consciousness patterns with extreme variability, unpredictable, chaotic, difficult to model or anticipate. The harmonic produced a sound like wind chimes in a hurricane. The old gods valued chaos, not valued, the lead architect corrected, its bodies moving in synchronized patterns of realization. Selected for, we must access idle database. If human can activate primary functions, perhaps can access stored information. Which is how she found herself, once again, with her hand on the idol's surface, except this time surrounded by enough scanning equipment to outfit a small research station, and monitored by representatives from 7 species, who were very interested in ensuring she did not accidentally unmake reality. She closed her eyes, reaching for that same mental space she had touched during the first activation. The idol responded immediately, warming under her palm, and suddenly her consciousness was somewhere else, somewhere that smelled like libraries and tasted like electricity and felt like falling upward into infinite complexity. The database opened to her like a flower designed by mathematicians having a collective breakdown. Information flooded through her awareness: star charts, species assessments, divine protocols, cosmic jokes that took millennia to set up and required at least 4 dimensions to properly appreciate. And buried deep within the streams of data, a file labeled in script that her brain kept trying to read as both compatibility assessment and audition results. The old gods, she understood with sudden clarity, had not been silent. They had been waiting, testing, watching. They had left these artifacts across the forbidden realms as a kind of cosmic filter, waiting for species that matched specific criteria: capacity for chaos, comfort with contradiction, willingness to press buttons labeled "do not press," and above all, an emotional range that could swing from profound philosophy to petty vindictiveness in the span of a single thought. Previous species had been too stable, too logical, too predictable. The Vex collective thought in perfect harmony. The crystalline Concordat operated on pure mathematical principles. The eternal students approached everything with measured wisdom. The old gods had found them boring. Humans, with their tendency to declare something impossible and then do it anyway out of spite, with their bizarre ability to feel 6 different emotions simultaneously and somehow make decisions based on all of them, with their evolutionary legacy of being persistence predators who solved problems by simply refusing to give up, represented exactly the kind of chaotic, unpredictable consciousness the old gods had been looking for. Not because humans were special, not because they were chosen or blessed or cosmically significant, because they were entertained. She opened her eyes, returning to normal consciousness with information burning behind her thoughts, and found the Warden staring at her with an expression that managed to convey existential horror despite his species' limited facial mobility. The old gods, she said slowly, had a hobby. The revelation that humanity had passed a 6-million-year-old cosmic audition by virtue of being sufficiently chaotic went over about as well as could be expected, which is to say that it triggered an intergalactic incident, 3 diplomatic crises, and a heated philosophical debate about whether being selected by ancient deities for entertainment value was an honor or the universe's most elaborate insult. The real problems started when the other artifacts began waking up. Ethros 9's idol was not alone, a fact that became spectacularly apparent when archaeological sites across 17 Forbidden Realm planets suddenly started reporting identical phenomena: obsidian relics glowing with warm amber light, symbols appearing in dead languages, and an overwhelming sense that something vast and ancient had just noticed that someone interesting had finally shown up to the party. The first activation outside Ethros 9 occurred on a planet called Void's Edge, where a human graduate student doing survey work had leaned against what everyone assumed was a decorative pillar and accidentally triggered a cascade reaction that lit up 47 divine relics simultaneously. The resulting light show was visible from orbit and caused the planet's 3 moons to briefly harmonize in a chord that translated to "finally, took you long enough." By the end of the first week, humans had activated 17 separate divine artifacts across 9 planets, each one yielding databases full of information about cosmic architecture, dimensional navigation, energy manipulation techniques that made fusion power look like rubbing sticks together, and an uncomfortable number of records, suggesting that the old gods had been treating the universe like their personal reality show. The Galactic Preservation Council convened an emergency session that lasted 4 days and produced a document titled Protocols for Human Interaction with Relics that was essentially 900 pages of bureaucratic language meaning please stop touching things but also please keep touching things because this is incredibly valuable but also terrifying. The Warden, whose crystalline structure had not stopped producing stress harmonics since the initial activation, found himself promoted to a newly created position: Human Artifact Interaction Supervisor. The job description was diplomatic. The actual role was closer to babysitter for the species that keeps poking cosmic horrors. He approached his new responsibilities with the resignation of someone who had looked into the abyss, found it looking back, and discovered that the abyss had terrible judgment and no sense of self-preservation. She became, overnight, the most watched being in explored space. Her neural patterns were studied by 43 different research institutions. Her biographical data was analyzed for clues about what made humans cosmically compatible. 3 separate governments offered her positions that ranged from cultural ambassador to please just tell us what you are thinking before you touch things. The University of Andromeda Reach created an entire department dedicated to human divine interface studies, with her as the inaugural chair despite her protests that she had absolutely no idea what she was doing and had only touched the thing because everyone said not to.
That is precisely why you are qualified, the department head explained. An elderly harmonic whose crystalline structure had gone slightly opaque with age. You possess the essential human quality, willingness to experiment with cosmic forces despite all available evidence, suggesting this is terrible idea. 6 months after the initial activation, she found herself standing in a lecture hall on a station orbiting a planet whose name she could not pronounce, preparing to teach a course called Divine Artifact Safety and Activation Protocols to a class of 30 students from 12 different species. The warden stood beside her at the front of the room, his crystalline form having achieved a permanent state of low-level anxiety that his medical professionals had declared chronic but manageable. Welcome to Divine Artifact Safety, she began, pulling up a holographic display showing the Ithros 9 idol. Lesson 1. Ignore all safety protocols established over the past 6 million years because apparently they were written by species the old gods found boring. A architect student raised 3 of its appendages. Is true that humans activate divine relics primarily through hubris and poor impulse control. That is offensive stereotype, she replied. Sometimes we also use spy. The warden produced a harmonic that translated roughly to please take this seriously. She continued. The old gods designed these artifacts as filters, testing mechanisms to find species with specific consciousness patterns. They wanted unpredictability, emotional range, capacity for holding contradictory thoughts simultaneously, and willingness to press buttons clearly labeled "Do Not Press." Why these criteria? Asked a deep void observer student, flickering between dimensions with youthful enthusiasm. Because, she said, pulling up records recovered from the divine databases, they were bored. The old gods achieved cosmic transcendence, gained power beyond mortal comprehension, and apparently decided that what they really needed was entertainment. They left these artifacts as casting calls for the universe's most chaotic species. A harmonic student produced a melodic sequence that conveyed deep concern.
What happened to previous species that old gods found interesting? The lecture hall went quiet. She pulled up another holographic display, this one showing extinction records cross-referenced with divine artifact locations. The correlation was, as the researchers had diplomatically phrased it, statistically uncomfortable. We do not know for certain, she admitted. The databases contain gaps, but 17 species showed compatibility with old god artifacts before humans. All 17 are now extinct. The record suggests they were given tasks, missions, cosmic errands, that the old gods found amusing. And humans, pressed the architect student. What tasks await us? She glanced at the warden, who managed to convey profound uncertainty through crystalline body language alone. We are still receiving transmissions from activated artifacts, she said carefully. The old gods left instructions, requests, cosmic to-do lists. Most of it we do not understand yet. Some of it we understand and wish we did not. There is apparently a dimensional barrier that needs maintenance. Something about universal heat death being ahead of schedule. A joke setup that requires 3 species from different time periods to coordinate the punchline. The students exchanged looks that transcended species barriers, and universally conveyed what have we gotten ourselves into. But here is the thing, she continued, warming to her theme. Those previous species, they approached divine tasks with reverence, dedication, cosmic responsibility. They took the old gods seriously, treated their requests as sacred duties. And this is bad? The deep void observer student asked. It is fatal, the warden interjected, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent 6 months studying extinction patterns. Species that treated old god requests as cosmic imperatives ceased to exist within 3,000 years. Correlation is not causation, but correlation is also making very aggressive eye contact. She nodded. The old gods were not looking for servants or worshippers. They were looking for species chaotic enough to tell them no, unpredictable enough to ignore instructions, and stubborn enough to survive contact with cosmic forces through sheer spite. A human student in the back row raised her hand. So our survival strategy is to be difficult. Our survival strategy, she corrected, is to be ourselves, which is, coincidentally, very difficult. The lecture continued for another hour, covering topics ranging from neural pattern recognition to why you should never promise an old god you will do something without checking what that something is first. By the end, half the students looked inspired, and the other half looked like they were reconsidering their career choices. As the class filed out, the warden approached her with the careful movements of someone navigating a minefield while blindfolded. New activation reported on Forbidden Realm designated Abyssal Deep, he said quietly. Human research team. They found structure covered in warnings in 47 languages. All warnings said do not enter under any circumstance. She felt the familiar weight of inevitability settling over her. Let me guess. They entered, found chamber full of crystalline matrices, pulsing with unknown energy signatures, covered in warnings saying do not touch. They touched. Enthusiastically. She sighed. Casualties. None. The matrices, activated, started producing atmosphere, terraforming dead planet. Researchers are calling it extremely successful scientific breakthrough. Preservation Council is calling it cosmic horror waiting to happen. They stood in silence for a moment, contemplating the fundamental truth that had become increasingly apparent over the past 6 months. Humans had not been chosen by the old gods because they were special, wise, or worthy. They had been chosen because they were the species most likely to see a sign saying danger, do not proceed, and interpret it as a challenge. I should go supervise them, she said finally. I will file the incident reports. The warden replied with the resignation of someone who had filed approximately 9,000 incident reports in 6 months, and expected to file 9,000 more. As she gathered her materials, she paused, looking at the holographic display still showing the Ethros 9 idol, glowing softly with its amber light. The old gods had chosen their champions well, she reflected. They had scattered their artifacts across the cosmos, waiting for a species too stubborn to take no for an answer, too curious to leave well enough alone, and too chaotic to predict. They had waited 6 million years for someone to show up who would look at their cosmic warning signs, and immediately start looking for loopholes. And humans had not disappointed. Somewhere in the space between stars, in the cosmic silence that was not silent at all, something ancient watched humanity begin its fumbling, chaotic, completely unpredictable interaction with divine relics. And if vast cosmic entities could eat popcorn, this one definitely was. The universe's longest setup was finally reaching its punchline, and the punchline was a species that treated warning labels as suggestions and divine artifacts, as interesting buttons begging to be pushed. The warden's descendants would be warning people about humans for millennia, and every single warning would be ignored by the next human who came along and decided that touching the glowing cosmic artifact was probably fine. The old gods, wherever they had transcended to, were undoubtedly delighted. After all, they had spent 6 million years waiting for a species entertaining enough to make universal heat death worth postponing, and humanity had finally shown up, ready to argue with physics, negotiate with cosmic forces, and generally cause the kind of chaos that made eternity interesting. And if that was not worth the wait, then the old gods really had no sense of humor at all.